In June of 1314, the might of England was set in motion. The largest army the nation had ever assembled, a torrent of gleaming steel and a forest of proud banners, crossed the border into Scotland with a single, brutal purpose: to crush the stubborn Scottish rebellion once and for all. At its head, King Edward II rode not as a general, but as an executioner on his way to a scheduled execution. Before them, in an insignificant field near Stirling Castle, an outlaw king, excommunicated by the Church, and his ragged army of peasants and impoverished nobles awaited their fate. For the English, it was not a battle. It was the final chapter of a conquest. What Edward II and his arrogant lords did not know was that the man waiting for them, Robert the Bruce, had not chosen a battlefield. He had chosen a tomb. Every stream, every marsh, and every foot of land had been turned into a weapon. The very soil of Scotland had been prepared to swallow the invading army. They were not marching to glory, but into a meticulously designed trap, a masterpiece of large-scale guerrilla warfare orchestrated by a man who had spent a decade on the run, learning and waiting for this precise moment. The battle would not be decided by the clash of steel, but by the intelligence of a king who was about to teach an empire the cost of arrogance. Robert Bruce did not defeat the English army. He dismantled it piece by piece before the first knight even charged. He transformed England's greatest strength, its invincible heavy cavalry, into its greatest weakness by choosing a battlefield that was a labyrinth of streams, bogs, and hidden traps. Bruce did not overcome his enemies with force, but with superior tactical intelligence, turning the very landscape of his homeland into his deadliest weapon. He forced the most powerful and feared war machine in Europe to become bogged down, to panic, and finally, to drown in a sea of mud and blood. Bannockburn is not the story of a battle, it is the story of the birth of a nation. The hero of this story is King Robert the Bruce of Scotland, a man forged in adversity. He is not a palace monarch, he is an excommunicated king, a former fugitive who has spent years waging a brutal guerrilla war from the shadows. Now, he is at the peak of his cunning and experience. He is a quiet, calculating, and ruthless leader whose strategic mind has been sharpened by a decade of fighting for survival. For him, this battle is not a desperate gamble, but the culmination of a master plan. It is his final move in a deadly chess game for the soul of his nation, and he has placed every piece on the board with lethal precision. His army is a reflection of his cause, small, resilient, and underestimated. Between 6,000 and 7,000 men, composed mainly of spearmen infantry. They lack the heavy armor and powerful war horses of their enemies, but they possess two things the English do not: an unshakable faith in their leader and the schiltrons. These are formidable defensive formations, hedgehogs of 3 to 5 meter long pikes capable of stopping the charge of the heaviest cavalry. Their motivation is the most powerful of all. After years of oppression and being hunted like dogs, this is their one chance to secure Scotland's independence forever. They fight not for a king, but for the very existence of their nation. The giant of this story is King Edward II of England and his formidable army. Edward is a man consumed by the shadow of his father, the legendary and feared Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. He is arrogant, but lacks his progenitor's military competence, and he is desperate for a glorious, crushing victory that will cement his authority. His mindset is not that of a strategist, but of an aristocrat who believes that power and divine right are enough to guarantee triumph. He sees the battle not as a tactical problem to be solved, but as a simple formality before the inevitable victory. His army is the embodiment of that power, a massive force of 16,000 to 20,000 men, dwarfing the Scottish army. Its crown jewel is over 2,000 heavily armored knights, the most devastating shock force in medieval Europe. An avalanche of steel and muscle trained to run down anything in its path. Their fatal weakness, however, is an arrogance that breeds blindness. They have an absolute contempt for the Scottish infantry, whom they consider mere peasants, and a blind, dogmatic faith in their cavalry charge. They completely ignore how the terrain, chosen by their enemy, can completely nullify their overwhelming numerical advantage and turn their greatest strength into a death trap. The battlefield south of Stirling Castle becomes Robert Bruce's silent general. It is crossed by a stream, the Bannockburn, and flanked by marshy wooded areas known as the Carse. To the English eye, it is difficult but manageable terrain. For Bruce, it is an instrument of war. The stream and the marshes create a natural funnel, a narrow corridor that is the only viable route of advance for the massive English army. This forces Edward's force to compress, to form a narrow front that completely nullifies their numerical superiority. His vast army will be unable to deploy, and his dreaded cavalry will be forced to charge in a confined space, becoming a danger to itself. It is here that Bruce deploys his genius, a preparation of the ground that turns the battlefield into a large-scale trap. Along the only firm path where the English cavalry can charge, he orders his men to dig hundreds of pits, the size of a man's knee, known as pots. Then, they are carefully camouflaged with branches and turf, making them invisible to a galloping rider. It is a network of anti-cavalry traps designed for a simple, brutal purpose: to break the legs of the war horses mid-charge, to destroy the momentum of the English vanguard, and to sow chaos and panic before a single lance can touch his men. To see how these simple holes in the ground dismantle the most powerful army in Europe, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications, because the trap is set and the history of Scotland is about to be born. The battle begins on the first day, not with a massive charge, but with an act of individual arrogance that becomes an omen. A young and impetuous English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, spots Robert Bruce inspecting his troops at a distance. Mounted on a small palfrey and armed only with a battle axe, the Scottish king is a tempting target. In an attempt to win eternal glory and perhaps end the war in a single blow, de Bohun lowers his heavy lance and spurs his massive warhorse, charging directly at the king. It is the duel that personifies the battle, the armored might of England against the cunning resistance of Scotland. What follows becomes legend. Robert Bruce, instead of fleeing, waits with a glacial calm. At the last second, he makes his nimble palfrey sidestep, dodging the tip of de Bohun's lance by inches. As the English knight thunders past, unable to check his momentum, Bruce rises in his stirrups. With a single powerful downward blow of his battle axe, he splits de Bohun's helmet and skull in two. The knight crashes down, dead before he hits the ground. The moral impact is immense. The Scottish army erupts in a roar of acclaim, their morale soaring. The English watch, stunned and silenced, having witnessed their champion slain by the enemy king. Despite this humiliation, English confidence is barely shaken. On the second day, determined to avenge de Bohun and crush the rebels, they finally launch their main attack. The impatient and proud English cavalry, the most feared shock force in Christendom, moves forward. Channeled by the narrow terrain and blinded by their contempt for the enemy, they gallop at full speed directly into the ground Bruce has prepared. It is the moment the Scottish king has been waiting for, the charge that should have decided. The battle becomes the beginning of the end for England. The vanguard of the English cavalry crashes into the field of hidden pots. The result is carnage. Horses stumble and fall with broken legs, throwing their armored riders to the ground. The ranks behind, unable to stop, pile into the mass of fallen men and animals, creating an indescribable chaos of steel, broken bones, and panic. The most powerful charge in Europe disintegrates before it reaches its target, turned into a traffic jam of armor, horses screaming in pain, and helpless knights, too heavy to quickly get up from the ground. Seeing the chaos in the enemy ranks, Robert Bruce makes a bold, almost unthinkable decision for the era. Instead of keeping his infantry in a static defensive position, he orders his schiltrons to advance. The Scottish pike hedgehogs, solid blocks of men and steel, begin to move like a living wall. Slowly and inexorably, they advance on the disorganized mass of English cavalry, pushing them back towards the muddy banks and deep waters of the Bannockburn. For the first time in medieval military history, infantry is not resisting cavalry. It is hunting it. The image is an inversion of the natural order of medieval warfare. The knights, the elite of the battlefield, find themselves trapped, unable to charge, unable to maneuver, being pushed into a trap of water and mud by peasants armed with pikes. Panic begins to spread through the English army. Their main weapon has been neutralized and is now turning against them. The battle, which should have been a glorious charge, has become a slow, agonizing meat grinder. At the climax of the battle, when the confusion in the English army is at its peak, the psychological coup de grace occurs. On a nearby hill, a new Scottish army suddenly appears. They are the sma folk, the camp followers, servants, cooks, and other non-combatants whom Bruce had kept in the rear. Seizing the opportunity, they organized themselves, raised makeshift banners from bedsheets, and let out a deafening war cry. For the English army, already demoralized, their morale shattered and trapped, the appearance of what they believed to be a new Scottish reserve force is the final straw. Discipline breaks completely. What resistance remained turns to panic, and panic to a desperate flight. The retreat becomes a chaotic rout. Knights try to flee across the stream, only to get stuck in the mud, where they are slaughtered by the Scottish spearmen. The battle transforms into a hunt. The Schiltrons advance relentlessly, while the Scottish light cavalry, held in reserve by Bruce, is now unleashed in pursuit, harrying and killing the fleeing English. The huge army of Edward II, the flower of England's chivalry, disintegrates. It is not a defeat, it is an annihilation. Bruce's trap has worked to perfection. King Edward II himself is caught up in the flight. He fights his way off the battlefield and embarks on a humiliating race to, safety, closely pursued by the Scots. His royal standard is captured, a symbol of the magnitude of the catastrophe. He barely manages to escape on a boat from Dunbar Castle, leaving behind the shattered remnants of his army and his prestige. The Scottish victory is total and absolute. They have faced a force 3 times their size, lured it onto ground of their choosing, and systematically dismantled it using intelligence, preparation, and discipline. Bruce has not only won a battle, he has shattered the invincibility of the English army and proven that a small, determined nation can defeat an oppressive empire. The battlefield at the end of the day is a testament to his genius. The Bannockburn stream, which gave the battle its name, is so choked with the bodies of English men and horses that it was said one could cross it dry-shod. The proudest and most powerful knights in Christendom, drowned in the mud and blood of the Scottish soil, have ironically become the bridge over which Scotland will walk to its freedom. The statistics of the carnage are a testament to the scale of the Scottish victory and the English catastrophe. Edward II's army was not simply defeated, it was annihilated. It is estimated that thousands of English soldiers died, but what was most shocking was the loss among the nobility. Hundreds of lords, barons, and knights, the heart of England's military ruling class, lay dead on the field or drowned in the stream. By comparison, Scottish casualties were incredibly light, perhaps only a few hundred. The loss ratio was so lopsided, it seemed more like a massacre than a battle, a proof of the lethal effectiveness of Robert Bruce's plan. The fate of the defeated commander, King Edward II, was a humiliation that resonated throughout Europe. His desperate flight from the battlefield, abandoning his army to its fate, shattered his prestige and authority. He returned to England not as a conqueror, but as a broken king, whose reign would be permanently stained by the greatest military defeat in English history. The catastrophe of Bannockburn fatally weakened his position, contributing to the political instability that would eventually lead to his deposition and presumed murder years later. The battle did not just cost him an army, it cost him his crown. For the Scots, the afterglow of victory was almost blinding. The loot captured from the extensive English supply train, valued at a fortune, enriched the kingdom for years. But more important than gold was the capture of high-ranking English nobles who were exchanged for Scottish prisoners, including Robert Bruce's own wife, his daughter, and the Bishop of Glasgow, who had been held captive in England for years. The victory not only brought freedom to the nation, but also reunited the king's family, adding a personal and poignant layer to the national triumph. The most important political consequence of Bannockburn was the de facto guarantee of Scotland's independence for nearly 300 years, until the Union of the Crowns in 1603. Although England did not formally recognize Scottish independence until years later, the scale of the defeat made any future large-scale conquest politically unfeasible. The victory led directly to the drafting of the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, a letter sent by the Scottish nobles to the Pope. This document, one of the most eloquent declarations of independence in history, affirmed Scotland's sovereignty and the right of its people to choose their own king, formalizing Scotland's status as an independent and sovereign kingdom. The battle became the cornerstone of Scottish national identity. Bannockburn is not just a historical event, it is the nation's foundational myth, a supreme and eternal symbol of victory against oppression, the ultimate proof that cunning, unity, and determination can defeat overwhelming power. The story of how a small army of patriots, led by a shrewd king, defeated the English giant has been passed down through generations, becoming an inexhaustible source of national pride and inspiration. The name of Robert the Bruce became inseparable from and synonymous with the struggle for Scottish freedom. Militarily, Bannockburn was a humbling lesson for feudal cavalry and an affirmation of the growing power of disciplined infantry. The victory of the Scottish schiltrons over the elite of English cavalry demonstrated that, on the right terrain and with the right tactics, infantry could not only resist but also defeat armored knights. The battle became a case study on the importance of choosing the terrain, preparation, and exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. It marked a turning point in medieval warfare, signaling that the era of the unquestioned dominance of the heavy cavalry charge was coming to an end. The legacy of Robert Bruce was forever cemented as that of the father of the Scottish nation. From being a noble with a dubious claim to the throne, an excommunicated outlaw, hiding in the islands, he was transformed into the warrior king who secured his people's freedom. His personal story of perseverance, of overcoming defeat and despair to finally achieve such a resonant triumph, became a metaphor for Scotland's own struggle. His victory at Bannockburn did not just secure a throne, it forged a national identity that endures to this day, a legacy of resistance and a fierce love of independence. The final and most powerful image of the battle is not of a king with an axe or a falling knight, but of the battlefield itself after the slaughter. The stream that gave the victory its name, the Bannockburn, had become a watery grave. It was so choked with the bodies of fallen English knights, their heavy armor dragging them to the bottom, and the carcasses of their powerful war horses that chroniclers of the time wrote a phrase that would become legend. One could cross the stream from one bank to the other, dry-shod, by walking on the dead. The proudest and most feared warriors in Christendom, the embodiment of feudal power, drowned in the mud and blood of the land they had come to conquer. Their arrogance had led them into a trap, and their own armor, the symbol of their status and power, became the anchor that sank them. In the most brutal and poetic way, the bodies of the oppressing army literally became the bridge upon which Scotland walked, free and defiant, into the dawn of its own nation. Scotland's freedom was built on the bones of its conquerors.